Today on Inside the Issues, I talk to Sang-hyuk Lee on North Korea and regional security. Hello and welcome to this week's edition of Inside the Issues, a CG online podcast. I'm David Welch, CG Chair of Global Security at the Balsley School of International Affairs, as well as Professor of Political Science at the University of Waterloo. And it's my pleasure every week to welcome a guest into the studio here at the Center for International Governance Innovation in Waterloo, Ontario, to talk about some important, timely topic in global governance, international public policy, or international policy in general. And this week I'm pleased to welcome Dr. Sang-hyuk Lee, who's Adjunct Assistant Professor at Renison University College, University of Waterloo, and also the Program Coordinator of the Japan Futures Initiative. So welcome.
Thank you very much for having me here.
So it's a pleasure to have you here because you're a unique person, as far as I know, who's got international experience in international education, born in Korea, studied in Korea, Japan, and Canada, lived in the United States, and recently completed a very large and important work on the study of Japanese policy vis-a-vis North Korea. So I think I can probably speak for a lot of our audience when I say that North Korea is very puzzling, a very difficult place for certainly people in North America to understand. So if it's okay with you, I'd like to just start picking your brains a bit about North Korea. So Korea, as I understand it, is not a place that understood itself to be two peoples historically. Korea understood itself to be a single people, but since the end of the Second World War, it's been divided politically, and especially since the early 1950s and the Korean War. It's been a very, very heavily fortified border between North and South Korea, and that South Korea and North Korea have evolved in very different directions. As somebody who's studied Korea and lived in Korea, how do you understand that evolution, and how do Koreans on both sides of the demilitarized zone understand Korea as a single concept?
As you said, Korea is, Koreans see Koreans as homogenous people, so we are one people. Historically, yes, most of the Korean history, Korea was a unified country, so most Koreans that I know would see Korea still as a one nation. So in that sense, Cold War division of Korea, South Korea and North Korea is an artificial one. It is seen as something imposed by not against the will of Koreans. So North Koreans and South Koreans, both of them, still officially, we all want to get unified. It's a matter of who unifies whom and in what sense, but the matter of unification itself is not something people would debate about. It is something that we will have to do.
It's a policy of both governments in Pyongyang and Seoul to reunify. Now, I've heard that it's North Korea used to be the larger and the wealthier and to some extent the more advanced of the two parts of the peninsula. Of course, that's radically changed.
During the Cold War period, after the Korean War ended in 1953, up to 1970s, late 1970s actually, North Korea was economically more wealthy because North Korea had always had more resources for industrial growth. They had hydroelectronic power, and they got a lot of aid from the Soviet Union, while South Korea also got a lot of aid from the United States. But because South Korea, for most of the Cold War period, was a military dictatorship, whenever an American regime changed, sometimes the bilateral relation would be good, sometimes it would be not so good. But until 1970s, North Korea, because it's a communist country and because it was highly centralized, they were better than South Koreans in economically developing itself, and especially heavy industries. But that changed from late 1970s and early 1980s, when Korea, it was still military dictatorship from 1980s on. South Korea really economically started to boom. So when I was growing up, when I was a kid, I still remember that South Korea was not as wealthy as North Korea at the time.
And yet now North Korea is, by some measures, one of the poorest countries in the world, at least if you measure human development. If you measure quality of life indicators such as
Certainly,
levels of nutrition.
Yes.
What's gone so badly in the North? I mean, if it was resource rich and it had all of this international support, particularly from the Soviet Union, how has North Korea managed to find itself in a situation where there's frequent mass starvation? They require vast amounts of international food aid, even just to prevent widespread famine, the shortages of electricity chronically.
Well, that's a question that is still tackled by hundreds of academics and policymakers, so I can't really give a clear answer to that. But it depends on who you talk to. Say from South Korean perspective, or I guess and generally from the international perspective, the biggest problem is North Korea's heavy dependence on military. So they are spending about, it depends, North Korea still, it's hard to see very transparent figures, but at least like 30%, 40% of their GDP goes to the military, and it has always been like that. But while during the Cold War, it was still okay because they got a lot of aid from the Soviet Union. But after the end of the Cold War, North Korea, Soviet Union stopped doing that aid, and also North Korea was very unlucky because North Korea was hit several times by very horrible famines, and they never actually recovered from that. So all these things combined, North Korea from that time on, economically, and North Korea was never able to open itself like China did. So, and opening up North Korea would automatically mean the end of its regime. So they have not been able to go along with the markets and go along with the international flows. But if you are looking at it from North Korean perspective, North Korean would say that it's all because of the United States, because United States has been de facto sanctioning North Korea and embargo on North Korea. So why North Koreans emphasize so much on talking only with the US is that once North Korea reopens its diplomatic relations with the United States, then North Korean assets abroad will be they will be able to use the international capital. But at this point, they cannot use international capital because the United States sees North Korea as a rogue state.
Right.
So it depends on who you talk to, but it's a blame game. Which one is to blame?
It's interesting that you mentioned that if North Korea opened up, the regime would fall. My understanding was that they have a very strong cult of the personality and have had for a long time. Kim Il-sung, the great leader, then his son Kim Jong-il, and now Kim Jong-un. Are they that vulnerable? That if they were exposed to foreign capital, foreign trade, foreign ideas, the regime would collapse, even though there's this cult of the personality and a strong tradition of that now? When
Kim Il-sung died in 1994 and Kim Jong-il came to power first, actually almost all North Korea experts expected that there would be a turmoil because Kim Jong-il was obviously not as strong and not as charismatic as his father, but North Korea somehow managed to promote that cult of individual. So Kim Il-sung, Kim Jong-il actually did pretty well. Now the problem is, even if you have this cult of Kim family, it's a dynasty, but all these ideas that are coming in from abroad, even if they believe in the cult of Kim Jong-il, it's still, nobody really knows what the actual consequences would be once it really starts to open. So they might actually do what the Americans and the South Koreans wanted North Korea to do, which was soft landing based on the Chinese style, so that the North Koreans would still organize the country along the regime that they already have now, but gradually open itself and open its ideas to the outer world. That would be a possibility, but we don't know because that had never happened. But it actually could collapse really easily because North Korea is not like China at the same time.
Right. Very good. We'll be back with Sung-hyuk Lee in just a moment. You're watching or listening to Inside the Issues, a CG Online podcast. Look for us at cgonline.org, on Facebook, on Twitter, and on YouTube. Welcome back.
Thank
so
you.
let's talk now about North Korea and its international footprint. Very isolated state,
Yes.
one of the world's most isolated, and yet frequently in the headlines
Yes.
because of what would appear to the casual observer to be
Yes.
erratic
Uh-huh.
and not readily understandable behavior.
Oh, you're not alone. South Koreans feel the same way too.
Right. So the United States, you mentioned, calls North Korea a rogue state.
Yes.
It's certainly an unusual state.
Yes.
So how do you explain, or how would you explain this pattern of behavior where, North Korea will agree to agree with its neighbors in the international community on this, that, and the other issue, and then apparently out of the blue do something shocking and provocative, like launching long-range missiles or testing a nuclear weapon or shelling a South Korean island,
Yes.
or possibly even sinking a South Korean corvette.
Yes.
Is there any rhyme or reason from your perspective to this pattern of oscillating behavior between cooperation and the reverse?
North Korea, I would say, well, there is no right or wrong answer for this, and anyone you talk to, they'll all come up with different answers for this. But I would say that despite all these differences, there is one consistent trend, and it is North Korea's focus on the United States. So sometimes North Korea would behave in a more friendly way toward the South Korea or Japan, or sometimes they would be very belligerent. But all along the way, if you see, they always focus on the fact that they want to talk with the United States, because the more as time goes, North Korea feels that it is insecure in this international world. North Korea cannot go on like this, and I think North Korean policymakers know that. And the only way North Korea can survive as a regime is to have signed a peace treaty, because Korean War is technically still going on because both sides never signed a peace treaty. It was a ceasefire. North Koreans feel that the United States, if the United States actually recognize North Korea as a sovereign country, and then United States promise that they will not attack North Korea, which would not happen, but North Koreans actually feel that way. If that happens, then North Korea would be able to keep its regime. And from North Koreans' perspective, so every time something happens that it's beyond our explanation, usually it is to show to the Americans that we still matter. You need to talk to us in order to change this situation in East Asia.
Mm-hmm. And do they really want a recognition from the United States, or would that somehow violate the principle of one Korea? Would that jeopardize Pyongyang's claim to be the legitimate capital of the entire Korean peninsula?
Actually, it is not contradictory to their idea of one Korea, because the reason why North Korea always want to only to talk with the US is because North Korea does not recognize South Korea as a sovereign state. They see South Korea as a puppet government of the US. And during the Korean War, North Koreans claimed that it was the war between North Korea versus the United Nations, but de facto the United States. So South Korea was part of the United Nations forces, and South Korea, from North Korean perspective, is not the party that North Korea should deal with.
And so it doesn't matter what policy the government in Seoul pursues, whether it's a sunshine policy or whether it's more of a hardline policy, Pyongyang doesn't care. No impact.
Of course, they care in a sense that, of course, they want to change this regional situation so that the regional situation would be more realistic for the realization of the North Korean policy, which is still unifying Korea, South Korea, unifying the whole Korean peninsula based on North Korea's ideology and signing the treaty with the United States. Of course, that's the ideal one. But North Korean government also knows that at this point in time, it's not 1950s anymore. It is not possible. But they cannot pursue the same policy as they did in the 1960s or 1950s. So they want to make sure that a lot of South Koreans actually do agree with the North Korean logic, and that's why nowadays North Korea is using a lot of international media to promote its ideas among Korean-speaking people, so that a lot of domestic audiences in South Korea would agree with North Korea and feel sympathy with North Korea. But the big trend is still not dealing directly with South Korea. Of course, they will, but the most important party to talk with is the United States, not Japan, not South Korea.
Very good. We'll be back again in a moment with Sung-Hyuk Lee. You're watching or listening to Inside the Issues, a CG Online podcast. Look for us at cgonline.org, on Facebook, on Twitter, and on YouTube. Welcome back. So I'm intrigued by the idea of North Korea promoting itself to Koreans worldwide. I remember back during the World Cup that South Korea and Japan co-hosted. North Korea made a big splash by sending what they called the Bijogundan, its army of beautiful women to Seoul, which apparently worked, prompted hundreds of offers of marriage from South Korean men. What are they doing now? How are they trying to promote themselves to South Korea now, and is it having any kind of effect?
I don't know what happened to those North Korean ladies who came to South Korea in 2002, but after Kim Jong-un came to power, obviously we don't really know what is happening within North Korea. Still, we really need to look at more data in order to see who's actually in power, what is going on within North Korea, what is happening in the military. But one thing interesting is that, as I mentioned before, North Korea has been using a lot of international media. They're using a lot of YouTubes and a lot of internet-based media in order to promote their ideas. And contrary to the past, they're actually showing a lot of military exercises and to show that North Korea is still powerful and Kim Jong-un is in control of the military, and North Korea is ordinary people are doing fine. And they also want to promote this cult of Kim dynasty to not just to South Koreans but to other foreigners as well. So you actually see some things in English, in Chinese, in Japanese. So I would say that is one difference that I noticed recently.
And is the message in those efforts, we're here and we're powerful, don't mess with us? Or is the message, we're a wonderful country, you should emulate us, you should want to be more like us? Is it really a hard power demonstration or a soft power effort to
I would say
attract?
both, but it depends on which audience they're targeting. If it's a Korean language one, especially a military-based one, their message is pretty clear. So don't mess with us. We will fight to the death if somebody attacks us. And because the Korean government at this point is a conservative government,
South Korean government.
Yes, South Korean government is conservative. They are actually very openly vocal about their criticism about the South Korean government and the president. But other language ones, it's about North Korea is also where ordinary people live, so music and nature and things like that. So I would say they're both, but either way, they are now more open about promoting their country than they were in the past.
And now in the past, they also did a number of seemingly bizarre things that didn't look as though they were well calculated to win friends and influence people, including airline hijackings and bombings and kidnappings of Japanese citizens on the shores of the Sea of Japan.
Yes.
I presume that was not part of a calculated strategy, soft power strategy to win friends and influence people.
No.
What was that all about? Why was North Korea interested in having that kind of international imprint?
Those incidents happened during the Cold War, so it would be a little different from North Korean provocation at this point. And the terrorism and things were still North Koreans do not admit the fact that they did it. So that's one issue. So North Koreans have never admitted to the bombing of the Korean airliners and other terrorism. Now about the Japanese kidnapping, North Korean Kim Jong-il, who died recently, Kim Jong-il actually admitted when the former Prime Minister Koizumi went to Pyongyang. So that is something unheard of. North Korea almost never admits and apologizes, but it apologizes. But at the time, when North Koreans apologized, Kim Jong-il made it clear that it was not his order, but some of his people, because they were overly loyal, they were overly patriotic, did kidnap Japanese against his explicit orders. So in a sense, they apologized and admitted, but he blamed it on someone else, so that North Korea as a whole was not to blame. And also at the same time, they said that it is also a very tragic consequences of the Cold War, because North Korea, from North Korean perspective, Korea is divided, and Japan is also to blame because Japan colonized Korea, and that's how the Russians and the Americans came to Korea in 1945. So from that point on, because North Korea had to liberate South Korea from the capitalist yoke, that's why they needed to use some Japanese in order to infiltrate North Koreans into South Korea as Japanese. So they admitted, but still there are North Korean discourses in there, and they were clear to make sure that those are they were transmitted to the Japanese and to the international audiences.
So the abductees were intended to be language teachers and cultural.
As far as we know, most of the Japanese were abducted. Yes, they went there to teach Japanese to North Korean spies, infiltrators who would infiltrate to South Korea, but also some Japanese were kidnapped to be the wives and spouses of Japanese who were living semi-permanently in North Korea, because during the Cold War there were some left movement in North Korea, in Japan. And for example, Japanese Red Army, who kidnapped the Japanese Japan airline, and then who tried to get asylum in North Korea, they were staying in North Korea, and some of them, apparently, the North Korean government wanted Japanese spouses for those people in there. Yes.
So, matchmaking in the most aggressive possible
Yes.
way. You're watching, we're listening to Inside the Issues, the CG Online podcast. Look for us at cgonline.org, on Facebook, on Twitter, and on YouTube. Welcome back. So let's talk about North Korea as a regional security issue and as a management problem. Now, very recently we've seen once again this oscillating pattern of behavior from North Korea, where signals coming from Pyongyang that they will now be more cooperative in allowing international inspections of nuclear facilities, and agreement to a moratorium on certain aspects of their nuclear program. Agreements apparently signed and sealed. Quid pro quo is food aid from the United States, and almost immediately after this, and guess what, we're going to launch a long-range missile under the guise of a satellite launch.
Yes.
What do you see happening now? It's almost as though Pyongyang is trying to undo previous agreements. One would have to imagine that they would have to think the United States cannot simply sit back and turn a blind eye to yet another long-range missile test.
Well, still, at this point, we really do not know the real motive behind this. So it's all guessing. But for North Koreans, Kim Il-sung's birthday is a huge issue, because after all, he is the father of the nation. And especially the fact that Kim Jong-un is the grandson, is now in power. In some ways, for domestic purpose, he needs to show to the people and to the international society that he is actually in power. And what is better than North Koreans launching a missile? And so at this point, I think whatever they say, I think it's not just a game. Probably they will actually launch it. But as you mentioned, the timing we should notice the timing, because it's right after they talk with the Americans. So the guess is that maybe because the United States, also the Obama administration, the thing is South Korean and the Americans, they will go through the elections quite soon. So from their perspective, they're trying to see how much the Americans and the South Koreans at the same time are trying to go, how far the Americans and the South Koreans would actually go as to stop them from doing that. But probably the North Korean calculation is that at this point, the United States and South Korea would criticize, but they would not be able to actually react as strong as during the early administrations. And so, I mean,
A test of wills.
yes. But at this point, for North Korea too, it is a very crucial time, and especially that the role of military is getting stronger and stronger. North Korea, Kim Jong-un, I personally think that he cannot look weak. So once they say that they have to show something drastic for the Kim Il-sung's birthday.
Now, the regional management of North Korea as a security problem has always been tricky, and the main organ for that was the six-party talks, which lasted for a total of, I forget how many years it was,
Yes.
5 years or 6 years?
Yes.
And went through several rounds,
Yes.
and I guess China was really taking the lead.
Yes.
China was the one party that
Yes.
had some degree of leverage over North Korea because it could control the energy flow to some
Yes.
extent.
Yes.
Now we don't really have a functioning governance arrangement to try to manage the North Korean situation. Should we? Is it time to start thinking about putting together a more coordinated international front to try to multilateralize handling the North Korean issue? Or is this still something that the Americans can only do because they're the only ones Pyongyang cares about?
I think that surely multilateral talk is needed. And if we actually come up with another one, still it would, one way or another, it should include all the six-party talks. So only the name will change, but the parties will remain the same. But as I mentioned, actually North Koreans would prefer to talk only with the United States. So North Koreans are not, from the beginning, they were not really a great fan of the six-party talks. So from that perspective, the United States and we all should talk with all the members who are affected by North Korea. But at this point, I think even if the international community forces North Korea to come back to either the six-party talk or something that resembles six-party talk, North Korea would probably wait until the new administration comes in the US and in South Korea as well. So from North Korea's perspective, it doesn't really mean that much if the regime in Korea, South Korea, or the United States will change so soon. And about China, yes, China is very influential, and China has become more influential over the years. But one thing that I think a lot of observers are overlooking is that North Korea is not, contrary to popular belief, always listening to China. That's why China has always been also frustrated by this process within the six-party talks, because despite the fact that China controls the flow of money and food and energy, still from the North Korean perspective, it's not that North Korea always listened to China as a little brother, as a lot of people think. And so I mean, multilateral talk is the ideal form, but I'm frankly not that optimistic. And another aspect that is overlooked is the case of Japan, because Japan clearly wants to become part of this talk, but Japan, for domestic reasons, Japan cannot sign anything on nuclear or missile issues unless this abduction issue is resolved. But North Korea at this point is adamantly claiming that it has already been resolved. So we cannot really see the prospect of this abduction issue going to another, to turning into a better situation. So it is, at this point, I think all these six parties are trying to see how the situation will change, but I don't expect to see much difference for a couple of months at least.
And Russia used to be an influential player because they were so supportive during the Cold War as the Soviet Union.
Yes.
Now they appear to be relatively unimportant, is that right?
Russia is still important in a sense that Russia Russia still has, Russia is still influential, not as much as China in material sense, but one thing that again is overlooked is that North Korea, from the beginning of North Korea, has been a very good disciple of Soviet Union and not China. And still a lot of connections within the Russian government and North Korea. There is a very good tie. And so even if even if Russia does not directly become the most influential party within the six-party talk, still other parties, United States, China, Japan, South Korea, will still need to talk and coordinate with Russia because Russia has some other access that other countries don't have.
Very good.
Yes.
Well, thank you for coming in and
thank you very much for having me.
Help clarify what is a very murky situation, and I suppose we'll
Thank
find
you.
out relatively shortly whether this so-called satellite launch has yet another dramatic impact on regional security.
Thank you.
And to our audience, thank you for joining us as always, and please join us again next week for another episode of Inside the Issues, a CG Online podcast. Look for us at cgonline.org, on Facebook, on Twitter, and on YouTube.
In what sense, but the matter of unification itself is not something people would debate about. It is something that we will have to do.
It's a policy of both governments in Pyongyang and
Yes.
Seoul to
Yes.
reunify. Now, I've heard that it's North Korea used to be the larger and the wealthier and to some extent the more advanced of the
Yes.
two parts of the peninsula. Of
Yes.
course, that's radically changed.
During the Cold War period, after the Korean War ended in 1953, up to 1970s, late 1970s, actually, North Korea was economically more wealthy because North Korea had always had more resources for industrial growth. They had hydroelectronic power, and they got a lot of aid from the Soviet Union, while South Korea also got a lot of aid from the United States, but because South Korea, for most of the Cold War period, was a military dictatorship, whenever an American regime...
The program coordinator of the Japan Futures Initiative. So welcome.
Thank you very much for having me here.
So it's a pleasure to have you here because you're a unique person, as far as I know, who's got international experience and international education, born in Korea, studied in Korea, Japan, and Canada, lived in the United States, and recently completed a very large and important work on the study of Japanese policy vis-a-vis North Korea. So I think I can probably speak for a lot of our audience when I say that North Korea is very puzzling, a very difficult
Yes.
place for certainly people in North America to
Yes.
understand. So if it's okay with you, I'd like to just start
Yes.
picking your brains a bit about
Sure.
North Korea.
Uh-huh.
So Korea, as I understand it, is not a place that understood itself to be two peoples historically. Korea understood itself to be a single
Yes.
people, but since the end of the Second World War, it's been divided politically, and
Yes.
especially since the early 1950s and the Korean War. It's
Yes.
been very, very heavily
Changed. Sometimes the bilateral relation would be good, sometimes it would be not so good. But until 1970s, North Korea, because it's a communist country and because it was highly centralized, they were better than South Koreans in economically developing itself, and especially heavy industries. But that changed from late 1970s and early 1980s when Korea, it was still military dictatorship from 1980s on. South Korea really economically started to boom. So when I was growing up, when I was a kid, I still remember that South Korea was not as wealthy as North Korea at the time. Yes.
And yet now North Korea is, by some measures, one of the poorest countries in the world, at
Yes.
least if you measure human development, and
Yes.
if you measure quality of life indicators such as
Certainly it
levels
is.
of nutrition.
Yes.
What's gone so badly in the North? I mean, if it was resource rich and it had all of this international support, particularly from the Soviet Union, how has North Korea managed a fortified border between
Yes.
North and South Korea? And that
Yes.
South Korea and North Korea have evolved in very
Yes.
different directions. As somebody who's studied Korea and lived in Korea, how do you understand that evolution? And how do Koreans on both sides of the demilitarized zone understand Korea? as a single concept?
As you said, Korea is, Koreans see Koreans as homogenous people, so we are one people. Historically, yes, most of the Korean history, Korea was a unified country, so most Koreans that I know would see Korea still as a one nation. So in that sense, Cold War division of Korea, South Korea and North Korea is an artificial one. It is seen as something imposed by not against the will of Koreans. So North Koreans and South Koreans, both of them, still officially, we all want to get unified. It's a matter of who unifies whom. And
Today on Inside the Issues, I talk to Sung-hyuk Lee on North Korea and regional security. Hello and welcome to this week's edition of Inside the Issues, a CG online podcast. I'm David Welch, CG Chair of Global Security at the Balsley School of International Affairs, as well as Professor of Political Science at the University of Waterloo. And it's my pleasure every week to welcome a guest into the studio here at the Center for International Governance Innovation in Waterloo, Ontario, to talk about some important, timely topic in global governance, international public policy, or international policy in general. And this week I'm pleased to welcome Dr. Sung-hyuk Lee, who's Adjunct Assistant Professor at Renison University College, University of Waterloo, and also the